Chapter 17 introduces the relative pronoun. And what is the relative pronoun? You probably don't even really know what that means, but the English equivalent for this is essentially the word who or whom, not the question word, but you'll see here in a second what I mean there. Who or whom, or we can say which, or also that. Okay, any one of those can be used for what essentially is the relative pronoun in Latin. These are the English equivalents. What the relative pronoun does, and this is the first time that we're getting this, is that it introduces what's called a subordinate clause or a subordinate clause. Okay, can't spell right now. Subordinate clause. Up until this point, we've only really had prepositional phrases and main clauses. We haven't had something like this yet, and now we're adding, this is when we're starting to add more complexity to the language. And we'll get into sort of what a subordinate clause is here in a second. So relative pronoun, your English equivalents, it introduces a subordinate clause, and it refers back to what's called an antecedent. Antecedent. And essentially what this is a word in the main clause. So let's just see here. Word in the main clause. That the relative clause describes. So an antecedent is a word in the main clause that this relative clause introduced by the relative pronoun describes. That sounds very technical. Let's get into some examples here in a little bit, and it might make a little bit more sense. It might make more sense then. But first, let's just look at, oh hey, another chart. Wow, that's amazing. Don't we know enough of those already? You never know enough. Never know enough. So for this chart, it's kind of, what I want to say, it has a mixed bag of things. We're going to see some third declension endings in here. We're going to see some first and second declension endings. We're going to see some endings that we've never seen before that are going to be used in different patterns. So realistically, this chart, you have to memorize it. There's no way around it. You just have to do it. You have to memorize it. You have to know it. But going in it, so again, we're going to have nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, ablative. It's a pronoun, which means it has these cases, and it functions like an adjective. So that's why we need all the genders, singular and plural as well. But here are the forms. Okay, so nominative, singular. It's going to be qui, quae, or quod. Qui, quae, quod. That's an O. The genitive form is cuius, which is actually going to be the same for all three. And the dative form is cui. So these ones have C's for whatever reason, thanks Latin. The rest are going to have Q's, like in qui, quae, quod. Okay. And then we have quem, quam, nominative, and accusative neuter are the same. So we have quod again. And then ablative is quo, qua, and quo. I won't be picky if you have the long marks or not. And then for the plural, okay, we're going to have qui, nominative. Nominative is qui, feminine, quae, which is kind of what we would expect. This I and this AE we usually have for adjectives. This one is quae, which is a little different. In the genitive, we have quorum, which if you've ever heard of needing like quorum for something, this is where it comes from. Let me see, let me try and fit this. Quorum, there we go. There we go. Quorum, quorum, quorum. Dative is going to be quibus. And we've had that ending before in the third. It's the same for all three. Accusative is quos, quas. And then again, nominative and accusative neuter are the same. So we'd have qui, and then quibus again for ablative. Now really you need to just know these. These forms, they're going to show up a ton. Latin uses this a lot, uses the relative pronoun a lot, and you need to be familiar with these forms. Okay, do you have to have every single one of them like seared into your brain? Probably not, except for the quiz that we're going to have on them. But realistically, you need to be familiar with when you're going to have these relative pronouns. And I'm realizing that my cues look weird now that I'm looking at them. I apologize for that. But memorize this chart. You need to know this chart. Write it down. Continue to write it down. Know it. Going on to how do we use this pronoun, okay? Really, there's only one thing we kind of need to know here. The rules are that a relative pronoun is going to agree with its antecedent, with the word that it's going back to. We're going to talk about that in a second, in two ways. It needs to agree with it in number and in gender. Okay. So remember, number is that idea of like singular or plural, while gender is either masculine, feminine, or neuter. Okay. So those two things are going to come from the antecedent, but the relative pronoun is going to get its case based on how it is used in its own clause. Okay, so how it's actually being used in its own clause. Okay, and what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at some examples here. Okay, so the sailor who loves Rome is good. One of the things that I would suggest is in Latin or in English is actually bracketing off your relative statement. You know, the sailor who loves Rome is good. The sailor is good is your basic sentence. So we would have, nautai, or nauta, sorry, and then est bonus. The sailor is good. Who loves Rome? Okay, now this who, it has to refer back to someone. It's antecedent, right? And that's sailor. It's actually the antecedent here. Okay. So what we're going to say is that sailor is nauta in Latin, which is masculine and singular. So that means that if we go back to this chart over here, the masculine singular chart, we're dealing with one of these here. Okay. And now we're going to say that's agreeing number and gender. Okay. But how it gets its case is based on how it's being used in this. The easiest thing to do is to put your subject in and swap it in here to figure out how it's being used in the sentence. And if we put the sailor here, we could say the sailor loves Rome. And that makes perfect sense. The sailor who loves, the sailor loves Rome, is good. Okay, and so this who here is technically nominative. So all you would need to do is the sailor, and then you would say qui. Okay. Rome, okay, in its own clause, who loves Rome? Who's doing the loving? The sailor. The sailor loves. What does he love? Rome. You want that in the accusative. Romam. And then the last thing you need is loves, okay? And that's just going to be amat, okay? Now if you look in English, we have the qui, okay? And you're pretty much going to always want to go from qui all the way until you get a verb, and then bracket that off. Okay, and that will then give you a good idea of your relative clause and your relative clause, relative statement, if you want to call it that. But always bracket it off. Bracketing off is a good idea. So the farmer is not a friend is your basic sentence here, and the farmer whom you see, okay, is your relative clause, adding more detail about the farmer. Okay, so our antecedent here is the farmer. Again, so there we go. Our basic sentence would be agricolae. I want to make them plural every time. Agricola. Okay, non est amicus, is not a friend. Okay, and then you have whom you see. If we flip this around and we put farmer into this clause, the only way it's going to make sense is you see the farmer, right? Well, again, farmer is masculine and singular. So we have to see, and if we just said you see, that would be vides, whom you see. And then if we want to say, you see who? The farmer. So again, we're in this masculine category, and we're going to want to make it accusative there. So it's going to be quem. Okay, so the farmer, quem, whom you see, quem vides, non est amicus. Again, we have an S here, so that's agreeing with that you. You could put two there if you want, you don't have to. But the relative pronoun, again, gets its gender and number, so masculine and singular, from its antecedent, from the word that comes before it, okay, that it's actually going back to and referring back to. But it gets its case, farmer's masculine, or I'm sorry, farmer's nominative. It's masculine too, but farmer's nominative. This is accusative, right? So the relative pronoun gets its case based on how it's being used in that relative clause, right? So this last one, we conquered many cities that were great, okay? Relative clause. Antecedent for what is great, that. What's this that going back to? Well, it's going back to cities, okay? So if we said we conquered many cities, you could put nos there if you want, and then many cities, feminine, multas urbes, many cities conquered, Ikimos, and realistically, this is actually going to go at the end here. Oh no. So we, many cities conquered, that were great. Okay, so now we have to see what this is. Cities is feminine and plural. Okay. So going back here, okay, we're going to be in the plural chart now. We're going to be using the plural and feminine plural. So we're going to want to use one of these forms, okay? But it depends on how it's being used, how that relative pronoun is being used in its own clause. So if we go back here and we say that were great, and we can just say the cities were great, and that's going to give us our meaning, and that makes sense. So we actually want to use nominative here. So it'd be quae. Looking at it again. So, oh no. So these cities, okay. So the cities, and then you would want to say quae, can't spell, quae, and then you could say quae magni, if you want to say that, and then were, so we'd say erant. Quae magni erant, or quae erant magni, again, going to your verb, and that's where it brackets off. From your relative pronoun to your verb, and that brackets it off. So there's no confusion then that this vikimos, we conquered, is actually part of your main sentence here, which goes from nos and then vikimos. Okay. Now I know that this is a fast introduction to these things. That an antecedent, the word that in the main clause that the relative pronoun describes. I know all these things. We're going to practice these, okay? But know this chart. Memorize it. Make it a part of of who you are.